In the summer of 1981, a Syrian MiG-25 Foxbat streaked across the skies above Lebanon's Bekaa Valley at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The pilot felt invincible. He had every right to. The MiG-25 was designed for one purpose, to be untouchable. Flying at 70,000 feet, faster than any missile of its era, it was the Soviet Union's answer to American high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. For over a decade, it had performed this role flawlessly. Western intelligence agencies could only watch helplessly as these silver darts raced across their radar screens, too high and too fast to intercept. Then, without warning, the Foxbat exploded. An American-made AIM-7 Sparrow missile, fired from an Israeli F-15 Eagle flying 20,000 feet below, had done what Soviet engineers believed was impossible. The pilot never saw it coming. Within weeks, it happened again and again. By the end of the year, Israeli pilots had shot down multiple MiG-25s under identical circumstances. Each time, the attack came from below. Each time, the Syrian pilots had no idea they were being hunted until the moment of impact. In Moscow, Soviet military advisors gathered in emergency sessions. The loss of a single aircraft could be explained away. Equipment failure, pilot error, bad luck. But this was different. This was systematic. The Israelis had found a way to kill the unkillable, and the Soviets had no idea how. The MiG-25's speed advantage meant nothing if the enemy could track it from below and fire with precision. Everything Soviet air doctrine had assumed about high-altitude superiority was suddenly in question. Was there a spy in Damascus feeding the Israelis' flight plans? Had the Americans developed a new generation of missiles with capabilities beyond anything Soviet intelligence had detected? Or was something else happening? Something more fundamental? The answer lay not in espionage or new weapons, but in mathematics. A single algorithm, developed in American laboratories and embedded in the radar system of the F-15 Eagle, had quietly revolutionized air combat. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand the problem it solved. For decades, fighter aircraft radar had been nearly useless for looking down at targets below. The reason was simple: physics. When a radar beam hits the ground, it creates an enormous field of return signals, a wash of electromagnetic noise that drowns out everything else. Imagine trying to spot a single bird flying low over a forest while standing on a mountain. The forest itself fills your vision. Every tree, every rock, every variation in terrain creates visual clutter. The bird disappears into the noise. This was the fundamental limitation of airborne radar throughout World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Pilots could track enemy aircraft above them or at the same altitude with reasonable accuracy. But looking down was like staring into static. Soviet engineers understood this limitation and designed their aircraft accordingly. The MiG-25 Foxbat wasn't built to dogfight. It was built to fly so high and so fast that it didn't need to. Its role was reconnaissance and high-altitude interception of American bombers. Soviet doctrine assumed that any threat would come from above or from the same altitude. An aircraft flying below the Foxbat was in the ground clutter, invisible, irrelevant. The Foxbat would see the enemy first, strike first, or simply outrun any pursuit. This doctrine had worked for years. But in the 1970s, American engineers at Hughes Aircraft Corporation developed a technology that changed everything. They called it pulse-Doppler radar, and it exploited a principle discovered by an Austrian physicist in the 19th century. Christian Doppler noticed that waves, whether sound or light, shift in frequency depending on the relative motion between the source and the observer. You hear this every time an ambulance passes you on the street. The siren's pitch rises as it approaches and drops as it moves away. The actual sound the siren makes hasn't changed. What changes is how the movement compresses or stretches the sound waves reaching your ear. American radar designers realized they could use this effect to filter out ground clutter. The ground isn't moving relative to the aircraft, or it's moving at the aircraft's own speed, but an enemy plane has its own velocity vector. Even if that plane is flying below you, lost in the visual noise of terrain, its motion creates a Doppler shift that's different from the background. If you could measure that shift, with enough precision, you could isolate the target from the clutter. You could see the bird in the forest. The mathematics were brutally complex. The radar had to send out pulses at specific intervals, compare the returning signals with microsecond precision, and calculate velocity differences in real time while the aircraft itself was moving at hundreds of miles per hour. The processing power required was enormous by the standards of the 1970s. Early pulse-Doppler systems were experimental, expensive, and unreliable. But by the time the F-15 Eagle entered service in the mid-70s, Hughes had refined the technology into something operational. The APG-63 radar in the F-15's nose could track targets flying below the aircraft, even against ground clutter. More importantly, it could guide missiles to those targets. This capability was called look-down, shoot-down. To Soviet planners, it sounded like American marketing. Western defense contractors were always claiming breakthrough technologies that turned out to be exaggerations or outright fabrications. The Soviets had their own radar research programs and understood the theoretical challenges involved. They knew pulse-Doppler technology existed, but making it work reliably in combat conditions, with enough processing speed and filtering accuracy to guide a missile onto a fast-moving target from a lower altitude, that seemed like a problem that would take years to solve. Soviet intelligence reports acknowledged the F-15's radar as advanced, but assessments concluded it was unlikely to perform as advertised in real combat scenarios. Then the Israelis proved otherwise. The Israeli Air Force had received F-15s in 1976 and spent years training with them, learning the aircraft's capabilities in ways that went far beyond the American manuals. Israeli pilots and technicians understood they would be fighting Soviet-built aircraft flown by Arab air forces, and they studied every aspect of Soviet doctrine, every limitation of Soviet radar technology, every assumption built into Soviet tactics. They realized the MiG-25's greatest strength was also a profound vulnerability. Syrian MiG-25 pilots flew with absolute confidence in their altitude advantage. They knew Israeli fighters below them were swimming in ground clutter, effectively blind. Soviet advisors had trained them to treat low-altitude threats as non-existent. This confidence made them predictable. They flew straight. They didn't maneuver defensively. They had no reason to. And because the MiG-25's own radar was designed for high-altitude interception, looking forward and up, it couldn't warn the pilot of a missile coming from below. Israeli F-15 pilots learned to exploit this with surgical precision. They would position themselves beneath the Foxbats' flight path, use the APG-63 radar to lock onto the target through the ground clutter, and fire the AIM-7 Sparrow missile from below. The Sparrow used semi-active radar homing. The F-15's radar illuminated the target continuously, and the missile rode that reflected signal all the way to impact. The Syrian pilot, flying straight and level at altitude, confident in his invulnerability, would be unaware of the threat until the warhead detonated. After the first shoot-down, Syrian and Soviet commanders assumed it was an anomaly. Perhaps the pilot had descended briefly and exposed himself. Perhaps there was a malfunction in the aircraft's radar warning receiver. After the second and third losses, panic set in. Emergency meetings were convened. Syrian MiG-25 operations were temporarily suspended. Soviet advisors flew to Damascus to investigate. They interviewed surviving pilots, reviewed flight data, and tried to reconstruct what had happened. The problem was that the Syrian pilots who were killed couldn't testify, and the ones who survived hadn't seen anything unusual. The Israelis weren't broadcasting their tactics. There were no boastful press releases about look-down, shoot-down radar. The technology itself was classified. Soviet intelligence knew the F-15 had an advanced radar system, but they didn't know its exact capabilities or how Israeli pilots were using it. The shoot-downs were clean, clinical, and left almost no evidence beyond the wreckage. For months, Soviet analysts developed theories. Some believed the Israelis had advance warning of flight paths, possibly through signals intelligence or a spy in the Syrian command structure. If the Israelis knew exactly when and where a MiG-25 would be flying, they could position F-15s along the route and get lucky with a missile shot. Others thought the Americans had secretly upgraded the AIM-7 Sparrow with a new seeker head capable of home-on-jam or infrared tracking. A few considered the possibility that pulse-Doppler radar was more effective than Soviet assessments had predicted, but this seemed unlikely given the technical challenges involved. The truth only became clear through a combination of intelligence work and technical analysis of captured missile fragments. When Soviet engineers finally understood what had happened, the implications were staggering. This wasn't about a new missile or a spy. This was about a fundamental shift in the technological balance of air combat. The Americans had solved a problem the Soviets believed was years away from a practical solution. Worse, they had done it quietly, embedded the technology in an operational fighter, and handed it to the Israelis, who used it to devastating effect. Soviet air doctrine had to be rewritten. Aircraft that relied on altitude and speed for survival were suddenly vulnerable. Pilots could no longer assume they were safe from threats below them. Defensive maneuvering, previously considered unnecessary at high altitude, became essential. Radar warning systems had to be redesigned to detect illumination from below. Training programs were overhauled. The entire tactical framework of Soviet air power, built over decades, had to adapt to a new reality. But the impact went beyond tactics. The MiG-25 shoot-downs exposed a deeper problem in Soviet military technology. The USSR had world-class physicists and engineers. They understood Doppler radar theory as well as anyone. The limitation wasn't knowledge, it was implementation. Pulse-Doppler radar required massive amounts of real-time signal processing, and that required advanced computer systems, miniaturized components, and sophisticated software algorithms. These were areas where the Soviet Union was falling behind. American semiconductor technology, driven by commercial markets and aggressive research investment, was generations ahead. The processors that made look-down, shoot-down possible simply didn't exist in Soviet production lines. This realization rippled through Moscow's defense establishment. If the Americans had this kind of advantage in airborne radar, what else did they have? How many other technological breakthroughs were hidden in Western weapons systems, waiting to be revealed in combat? The confidence that had defined Soviet military planning since World War II began to crack. For the first time, Soviet leaders had to confront the possibility that they were losing the technological arms race not because of a lack of scientific talent, but because their economic and industrial systems couldn't keep pace with Western innovation. The Israeli shootdowns also changed American perceptions of the Cold War balance. For years, Pentagon planners had feared the MiG-25 as a symbol of Soviet technical prowess. Its speed and altitude capabilities seemed to represent a kind of brute force engineering that Western aircraft couldn't match. The revelation that a relatively simple tactical application of pulse-Doppler radar could neutralize the Foxbat completely shifted the conversation. American strategists realized that technological sophistication could counter raw performance. You didn't need to build a faster plane. You needed smarter sensors and better information processing. This insight accelerated investment in what would later be called network-centric warfare. The idea that individual platforms mattered less than the information systems connecting them became central to American military thinking. Radar technology, data links, computer processing, these were the new frontiers of military power. The shootdowns over Lebanon were an early, dramatic proof of concept. For the Syrians, the losses were demoralizing. The MiG-25 had been a symbol of Soviet support and technological superiority. Pilots had trusted the aircraft absolutely. Now that trust was shattered. Syrian air operations became more cautious, more defensive. The psychological impact of knowing that Israeli fighters could kill you from below, invisibly, even when you thought you were untouchable, was profound. It changed how Syrian pilots flew, how willing they were to engage, how much risk they would accept. And for Israel, the successful employment of look-down, shoot-down technology was a validation of their approach to military innovation. The Israeli Defense Forces had always emphasized quality over quantity, using superior training and technology to offset numerical disadvantages. The F-15 shootdowns were a textbook example of this philosophy in action. A small number of highly trained pilots, using advanced American technology adapted to Israeli tactics, had achieved results far beyond the raw numbers. But the broader lesson of the MiG-25 shootdowns wasn't about Israel or Syria or even the F-15 versus the Foxbat. It was about the nature of military revolutions. Throughout history, dominant weapon systems have been rendered obsolete not by better versions of the same thing, but by entirely new approaches that exploit previously unknown vulnerabilities. The English longbow didn't beat French knights by being a better sword. It changed the rules of engagement. Steam power didn't make sailing ships faster. It made wind irrelevant. Pulse-Doppler radar did something similar to air combat. It didn't make aircraft faster or more maneuverable. It made altitude less important and invisibility from below impossible. Soviet designers had built the MiG-25 to dominate a specific kind of fight, and for a decade it succeeded brilliantly. But the fight changed, the rules changed, and a single algorithm, a mathematical technique for filtering signal noise, was enough to turn dominance into vulnerability. By the mid-1980s, every major air force in the world was racing to develop or acquire look-down, shoot-down capability. The Soviets poured resources into upgrading their radar technology and building aircraft with better processing power. Western nations refined pulse-Doppler systems further, making them lighter, more reliable, more effective. The technology that had been a closely guarded secret in the late 70s became standard equipment by the 90s. Today, look-down, shoot-down radar is so fundamental to fighter aircraft that it's hard to imagine air combat without it. Modern jets are built around the assumption that you can track and engage targets in any direction, at any altitude, through ground clutter and weather, and electronic interference. The idea that altitude alone could make you safe seems almost quaint. But in 1981, it was a revolution. And for the Soviet pilots who died over Lebanon, never knowing what hit them, it was the end of an era they didn't realize had already passed. Some Cold War truths were buried on purpose. We dig them up here. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files.